Weber argued that what appears to be freedom in modern society might actually be a cage, an iron cage made not of metal, but of bureaucracy, efficiency, and procedures. Consider this. The same systems that promise predictability and fairness can also confine us through layers of rules we never authored and choices we never made. Waiting rooms, forms, and endless approval steps are not mere accidents, but indicators of a deeper structure. This paradox lies at the core of Weber's warning about rationalization. It also prompts a more difficult question. Why do we continue to obey these systems at all? Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. Before we begin, just a quick housekeeping note. If you enjoy what I'm doing, a like and subscribe would be really helpful. It goes a long way in keeping the channel going. And don't forget to drop a comment. I'd really love to know what you think. Every day, you are surrounded by rules. Some are written into law, others are unwritten customs, and together they influence your choices in ways you hardly notice. What is striking is how often you follow these rules without anyone overseeing you. There are no guards posted on every pavement, no officer at every corner, yet behavior remains consistent and predictable. This raises what Weber called the puzzle of obedience. Many people assume the answer is simple: fear. Disobey a law, and punishment follows. Yet fear alone cannot explain the extent of compliance you observe. Take a queue, for example. You wait your turn not because armed officials are lining up at the entrance, but because the practice feels right, even necessary. Cutting in may earn you disapproval, but not a prison sentence. The pressure is social, not physical, and it persists. Consider also a red light at an empty junction. Every day, countless drivers stop without a police officer in sight. It's easy to speed through when no one's watching, but most don't. Traffic halts almost in unison, an order that feels stronger than surveillance. Obedience here occurs without coercion. The question is, what maintains it? Habit may seem like the only answer. Rules learned early in life become second nature and are deeply ingrained in our behavior. However, habit cannot explain everything. Entire populations adapt to new regimes, constitutions, or laws, often quite swiftly. If habit were the only factor, legitimacy would break down each time rules changed. Nonetheless, order persists even when the framework shifts beneath people's feet. This is where Weber's distinction between power and domination becomes essential. Power, or Macht, is the ability to enforce your will despite resistance. However, domination, or Herrschaft, is different. It is the likelihood that a command will be obeyed. Domination occurs when power is combined with legitimacy, when authority convinces people that their commands merit recognition and respect. This difference is significant. Power might compel action through coercion, but domination encourages voluntary obedience. Viewed this way, obedience is not solely about enforcement, but also about belief. Weber argued that people typically comply because they see authority as legitimate. Legitimacy here does not always mean democratic approval or popular voting. What matters is that those in power succeed in creating a system of justification. Leaders and institutions promote shared myths of fairness, order, or competence, which persuade people that it is in their interest to obey. Even if elections never occur, obedience can be maintained if the public accepts that the authority serves some purpose they recognize as valuable. Reconsider the example of traffic lights. You don't stop because you fear punishment at every junction. You stop because you accept that this system has the authority to regulate movement, and because you trust that others do too. Compliance is based on shared understanding, not on constant threats. The same applies to money. A piece of paper or a digital entry in your account holds value because almost everyone recognizes it as legitimate. You don't test whether gold is stored in a vault. You transact with confidence because legitimacy turns symbols into trust. Without that foundation, money would collapse into meaningless signs. This illustrates why pure force cannot sustain societies for long. Imagine a system governed solely by intimidation. People might obey when under close surveillance, but once attention wanes, disobedience would resurface. Such an order is unstable, fragile, and draining to uphold. Legitimacy, however, weaves obedience into everyday life. It accompanies people into new situations, reinforcing order even when nobody is watching. That makes seemingly small habits particularly revealing. Why do strangers reciprocate greetings? Why does a classroom expect the teacher at the front, or a courtroom recognize a judge in robes? These are not just raw acts of power. They are expressions of legitimacy embedded in routine, signals that obedience has been internalized. The rules are followed because people share a belief in their appropriateness. Different societies reach this point through various sources. In one society, obedience may result from long-standing customs. In another, it might originate from belief in a leader's exceptional qualities. Elsewhere, it comes from formal laws enacted and enforced by officials. Each of these patterns sustains domination by making it seem natural to consent. As Weber noted, remove legitimacy, and authority quickly erodes, regardless of how many weapons support it. You can see then that obedience is not a sign of weakness, but a mark of shared trust. When you stop at a light or hand over a banknote, you are participating in a vast network of mutual belief. The very ease of the act hides how much it depends on legitimacy. It shows why complex societies remain coordinated without constant enforcement. For Weber, this realization paved the way to a typology of authority. If legitimacy underpins obedience, then authority can no longer be seen as a single entity. It manifests in different forms: traditional, charismatic, or legal rational, each influencing compliance in unique ways. Some depend on tradition, others on the allure of personality, and still others on the precision of written rules. These forms do not have equal strength or risk. They fluctuate over time, and their balance can change. That shift becomes crucial when considering the conditions of modern life. Certain types of legitimacy foster habits of thought and behavior that extend well beyond police or courts. They influence how people approach their daily routines, including something as commonplace and essential as work. When work itself is affected by legitimacy, the structure of society undergoes significant changes. Why did capitalism thrive in some societies while others fell behind? At first glance, you might point to technology, expanding markets, or human ambition as the key factors. But Weber noticed something less obvious. Looking at Europe, he observed that Protestant regions often appeared more economically vibrant than Catholic ones. For him, this was not a coincidence, but a clue. Belief systems, he proposed, could influence economic behavior in ways material changes alone could not. Machines and markets mattered, but without a confident attitude towards work, they could not explain the scale of capitalist growth. Weber's interest in this issue was not abstract. Before his breakdown in 1897, he was openly enthusiastic about capitalism and liberalism, with a pressing concern: why parts of Germany, especially in the East, appeared hindered from development. The contrast between prosperous Protestant regions and struggling Catholic or agrarian areas sharpened his curiosity. He started to suspect that cultural factors rooted in religion played an overlooked but decisive role. This line of thought would lead him to what he later called, unlike older cultures where wealth often carried moral suspicion, Protestant communities connected work to religious duty. This made work more than just necessary toil. It became a spiritual obligation. The transformation was remarkable. Daily labor was lifted from the realm of drudgery and given moral significance. In this framework, diligence in one's occupation was a way of serving God directly. Work thus became a testimony of faith, not merely a means of survival. The roots of this change were rooted in Martin Luther's concept of Beruf, a German word that signified both occupation and calling. His biblical translation presented this term in a way that deeply redefined labor. Instead of seeing sanctity as withdrawal from worldly life, as medieval asceticism demanded, Luther asserted that one must stay active within worldly responsibilities. From a medieval perspective, saints often distanced themselves from the world, retreating into monasteries or hermitages. Luther's innovation was that sainthood could be discovered in everyday tasks. The farmer in his field, the artisan in his workshop, the merchant ensuring fair measures. Here, vocation was not a distraction from holiness, but its very expression. This outlook marked a notable shift. If work were merely worldly toil, one did just enough. But if work was a calling, then time was sacred. Wasting hours became a moral failing, while using them wisely was a sign of devotion. Everyday activities now carry eternal significance. This attitude fostered discipline, punctuality, and seriousness about even the most minor tasks. Over time, when repeated in households and communities, it cultivated habits ideally suited for disciplined economic activity. Calvinism advanced this moral shaping even further. Its doctrine of predestination stated that salvation was chosen by God before birth, fixed and unchangeable. This teaching generated deep anxiety. Believers wondered, if nothing I do can change my fate, why bother trying? Why labor at all? Ministers offered a practical reassurance. Although deeds could not alter destiny, they might reveal signs of grace. Hard work, thrift, and success in labor could indicate God's favor. The psychological weight of this was immense. Imagine believing your eternal fate was fixed but hidden, then being told that outward conduct might hint at your standing before God. Every act of diligence, each careful record, every refusal of waste became freighted with spiritual implications. Economic activity became a field for demonstrating one's worth among the elite. People labored furiously, anxious yet disciplined, hoping their success was a reflection of salvation. This is how asceticism, usually a renunciation of worldly pleasure, was used for economic productivity. Calvinism promoted restraint and enjoyment while also emphasizing commitment to work. The paradox is apparent. A doctrine that discouraged luxury and indulgence provided the foundation for a system based on accumulation and wealth. The merchant who kept meticulous accounts, saved surplus, and reinvested rather than feasted was not seen as miserly, but as faithful. What was once scorned as greed was now viewed as a moral virtue. Consider the daily routines of a Protestant merchant. Diligent ledger keeping and cautious investment became both moral and practical acts. Each act of self-restraint, opting to reinvest rather than indulge, resisting frivolous display, served as proof of inner discipline. While medieval teachings had vilified profit-seeking, these practices elevated it to a religious duty. vice transformed into virtue. The ethical standards of European culture were overturned, reshaping entire communities in the process. It was not just individuals who changed. Entire societies began to adopt these norms. Children were brought up with habits of punctuality and self-control. Communities organized themselves around shared expectations of discipline. Daily economic activities were regulated not by punishment, but by conviction. For Weber, this signaled that something new had entered the cultural bloodstream, a spirit uniquely suited to the routines of capitalism. Here, rational calculation entered decisively. If wealth was no longer considered shameful, but instead sanctified, precise methods to measure it became both necessary and celebrated. Double-entry bookkeeping emerged as more than just a technical innovation. It embodied a new mentality. To record each debit and credit in a system that balances down to the last unit was not merely about maintaining order, but about affirming a rational and disciplined approach to the world. While Adam Smith would later view rational calculation as universal to human trade, Weber argued it was a distinctly historical phenomenon, emerging with this cultural and religious transformation, rather than existing entirely in antiquity. Its presence signified a shift from traditional dealings to modern capitalism. This system encouraged viewing the world as a series of costs and benefits, risks and measures, carefully recorded and assessed. Rationalization extended beyond business and spread into other areas of life. Planning, efficiency, and reinvestment became guiding principles. Through these, capitalism gained structure and predictability. Yet, beneath the surface, lay habits shaped by religion and ethical commitments, absorbed long before the industrial age flourished. Weber was careful not to overstate his case. He did not claim that Protestantism alone created capitalism, nor that material innovations were insignificant. He emphasized that both matter and ideas work together in shaping history. However, he wanted to show that belief systems could provide energy just as vital as machines or markets. Religious doctrines, when incorporated into everyday habits, foster the cultural environment that made new institutions not only possible, but also powerful. Work, thrift, and rational planning. These were no longer neutral practices, but moralized imperatives. Large populations behaved as though worldly diligence reflected eternal health. In this way, religious values left an enduring footprint on economic life. The hidden roots of modern work were embedded here, in the notion of calling, in the anxiety of predestination, in the careful books and restrained expenses. This complex web of duty and calculation created a cultural climate where capitalism could spread far beyond mere subsistence. From this, another quiet shift emerged. Once work itself was regarded as sacred, and accumulation was seen as a moral duty, broader attitudes towards wealth also changed. Profit and gain were no longer just tolerated, they began to appear virtuous. This shift in ethical outlook would have consequences not just for work, but also for how morality was defined in everyday economic life. In earlier centuries, the pursuit of profit was regarded with suspicion. Religious teachings warned against it, particularly the charging of interest, which was condemned as usury. Excessive accumulation drew moral disapproval. Wealth was often seen as a temptation that diverted people from salvation rather than guiding them towards it. To suggest that making money for its own sake might be virtuous would have sounded dangerous. However, over time, attitudes changed. What was once condemned as vice began to be seen as a sign of virtue. For Weber, this reversal marked one of the most significant cultural shifts that capitalism brought into human life. How did greed change so completely in moral terms? At first glance, the desire for more appears to be a universal phenomenon. Throughout history, people have exchanged, stored, and saved food and resources to protect against shortages. However, Weber distinguished between meeting basic needs and what capitalism required. Before the advent of modern capitalism, farmers and artisans typically worked until their basic needs were met. Once they had food, shelter, and a modest level of comfort, the motivation to produce more decreased. Labor stopped once necessity was fulfilled. Building up surpluses was optional, rarely obligatory. What capitalism required was different, a continuous cycle of accumulation, a drive that is feltless of bare sufficiency. This transformation was built on the moral principles established by Protestant ethics. Work, thrift, and restraint were elevated into moral duties. Profit was no longer regarded as indulgence, but as the result of discipline and responsibility. When gain was obtained through honest effort and reinvestment, it was no longer seen as greed, but as a sign of virtue. Someone once branded as greedy could now be viewed as upright, thanks to this new moral perspective. Weber described the resulting perspective as the spirit of capitalism. He linked it directly to a new ethical obligation. Working hard and earning money became not only practical, but also virtuous. To aim constantly for success was not condemned, but admired as evidence of moral character. In this context, wealth itself was not the aim. The greater purpose was to approach one's work and pursuit of profit with calculation, discipline, and seriousness. Living idly was considered dishonorable, whereas working steadily, keeping precise accounts, and reinvesting responsibly were what defined a good person. Accumulation became a sign of ethical duty, not material greed. Imagine a shopkeeper behind his counter, meticulously working through columns of figures in a ledger. He does this not only to check stocks or monitor survival, but because maintaining orderly accounts signifies principle. Each sum demonstrates control, foresight, and dedication to his craft. The practice of double-entry bookkeeping cemented this idea. It was practical, enabling traders to measure input and output precisely, but also symbolic. In one column, you recorded costs and effort, what you spent on work and money. In the other, you noted gains and returns. Profit emerged from the imbalance between the two. The exercise itself became a symbol of rationality, showing that labor and profit could be captured through orderly calculation. For Weber, it epitomized the disciplined pursuit of wealth under this new ethic. This approach signaled that capitalism was not about reckless indulgence, but about self-denial. Driven by the new moral framework, individuals resisted excessive consumption and redirected profits into socially responsible businesses. Savings fueled future growth. Lavish displays were frowned upon. In their place, virtue was found in discipline and reinvestment. Greed became a virtue precisely because it was governed by calculation and control. To expand work and grow wealth rationally was nobler than resting satisfied. Time itself shifted meaning under this ethic. In many older societies, daily life was governed by natural cycles, seasons, sunrise and sunset, or festivals. Labor rose and fell with rhythms of need. Under the spirit of capitalism, time became a resource weighed with moral significance. Time is money ceased being just a practical observation and became an imperative. Wasting hours was not simply inefficient, but morally wrong. Productivity became an ever-present demand. Each moment unfilled with work was seen as a lost virtue. In this mindset, devotion to labor evolved from a temporary necessity into a permanent duty. This transformation developed gradually, not overnight, as more individuals came to regard hard work, thrift, and rational accumulation as moral duties. New habits took hold. Once these practices reached a particular scale, entire communities changed pace and grew faster than others still rooted in older traditions. Success validated the power of the ethic. It was not just personal ambition, but a widespread cultural shift. A shared belief in disciplined gain enabled communities to expand their economies, reinforcing the moral approval of accumulation. What was once personal became collective, shaping institutions and expectations broadly. Weber highlighted this collective character because it demonstrated that capitalism was more than just a matter of commerce. It was a cultural system rooted in morality. Greed lost its shame once accumulation was associated with virtues like sobriety and industriousness. The continual growth of profit became acceptable because it was seen as a duty rather than an indulgence. Profit, once viewed with suspicion, gained a moral legitimacy rooted in responsibility. Communities that adopted this ethic felt unified by shared discipline. For those still wary of wealth, the differences in growth and prosperity became increasingly evident. The consequences radiated outward from shop counters and ledgers. The rational mindset behind meticulous bookkeeping was soon adopted elsewhere. Schools introduced examinations measured by standardized criteria. The law shifted from an oral tradition to detailed written codes. Medicine developed a systematic approach to diagnosis and treatment based on evidence rather than tradition and ritual. The ethic of rational calculation gradually extended into these fields. In each case, the principle remained the same: order, predictability, and system provided by rational procedures. Thus, the moralization of profit laid the foundation for the rationalization of entire social spheres. When Weber discussed greed becoming a virtue, he was describing more than just a change in individual behavior. He showed how civilization reorganized judgment itself. Thrift, work, and rational calculation became sacred signs of discipline. Obedience to these values changed both economic actions and daily identity. The act of recording sales or calculating returns carried more than financial significance. It held moral importance. And once societies began to see disciplined accumulation as a virtue, capitalism gained cultural strength that no earlier economy had achieved. You still live with that legacy: growth, efficiency, profits. These remain signals of success, often presented as self-evidently good. Economic statistics do not only describe, they mark collective achievement and well-being. The moral force once tied to individual salvation has been translated into measures by which nations and individuals alike evaluate themselves. Although we seldom use the word, greed continues to be treated as a virtue, reinforced by structures inherited from centuries of moral transformation. Recognizing this history opens the door to another of Weber's insights. If accumulation became a virtue through rational calculation, what are the broader consequences when rational calculation itself spreads everywhere? Rationalization does more than organize accounts. It reshapes law, education, and social life. By removing old habits of magic and mystery, the world becomes more predictable, stripped of enchantment. It is to that process that Weber next turns his concern: how rationalization promises order, yet at a cost pressed into every part of modern life. Rationalization arrived with an ambitious promise: a world of order, predictability, and precise measurement. Where once custom, ritual, or chance seemed to control events, rational systems offered the hope of security. Exams could be relied upon to grade students consistently. Factories could operate on a schedule rather than at whim. The law could provide equal treatment under transparent rules, rather than the whims of rulers. Life seemed more stable when guided by procedures designed to treat everyone equally. It was the dream of progress through applied reason, a way of taming uncertainty with structure. But for Weber, the deeper question was, what is surrendered as rationalization advances? He described this as the disenchantment of the world. Disenchantment meant more than a general loss of mystery. It referred to the removal of magic from human experience itself. In earlier cultures, rain was often seen as a gift or a punishment from unseen forces, something that prayer or ritual could influence. Under rationalization, you learned instead that it falls from measurable weather systems, and you understood there was little you could do to alter its course. The gain was knowledge, but the cost was wonder. Existence no longer needed explanation through spirits or myth. It became calculable. Yet along with superstition, much of life's enchantment seemed to slip away. Consider the example of education. In earlier centuries, learning often meant apprenticeship or tutoring, a process shaped by intimate craft or family bonds. Each student's abilities could be recognized in their own way. As rationalization spread, schools evolved into bureaucratic systems. Curricula became standardized, teaching took place in large classrooms, and graded tests assessed progress. The outcome was efficiency. Many students could be taught simultaneously, with their performance compared on a single scale. However, the cost was personal. A score replaced the teacher's judgment of character, and individuality was diminished under numerical scores. Work shows a parallel shift. Once, tasks followed daylight, seasons, or the rhythm of skill. Industrialization introduced new regimes of clock time. Bells signaled when to start and when to finish. Jobs were divided into repetitive steps, linked to machines operating at fixed speeds. This led to enormous productivity, but also brought repetition and monotony. Instead of adjusting labor to life, life was adjusted to fixed schedules. Rationalization made work more efficient, but it also altered how people experienced their own time, shrinking it into segments measured against mechanical standards. Law also adopted a rational form. For many centuries, justice was often determined by custom, religious law, or the discretion of a ruler. This usually meant arbitrary outcomes. Rationalization aimed to end this by replacing flexibility with codified rules and trained legal experts. Courts became organized around precedent and procedure. This introduced predictability. Each person faced the same process regardless of status or circumstances. However, it also risked diminishing human judgment. A judge increasingly acted more as an enforcer of procedure than a dispenser of wisdom, and cases seemed like formulas applied to individuals, leaving less room for their particular context. Medicine, too, entered this march. Healers had once relied on family knowledge, with remedies passed down through generations and personal trust between patient and practitioner. Diagnosis was achieved through stories, rituals, or the healer's familiarity with a household. Rationalized medicine transformed this relationship. Attention shifted to disease categories, standard treatments, and objective tests. Charts replaced stories. Laboratories replaced inherited knowledge. On one hand, this led to life-saving breakthroughs and more precise diagnoses. On the other hand, the patient could easily become a set of symptoms attached to a case file. A family member known for their quirks and history became a depersonalized subject within protocols. The bond of personal care was traded for efficiency through universal categories. These examples, school exams, factory schedules, codified law, and medical charts, illustrate rationalization's double edge. For every increase in objectivity and fairness, something else diminishes. Superstition disappears, but so does intimacy. Ritual gives way to rules, and spontaneity yields to structure. Rationalization eliminates bias and uncertainty, but it creates impersonal systems in their place. That is why Weber described this change with such urgency. Disenchantment was not only the passing of old superstitions, it was the clearing away of the very texture of meaning that once surrounded life. A storm became a weather map, illness a measurable set of symptoms, and learning a rank on a list. For many, safety increased, but the depth that came from shared myth or a teacher's personal sense of you became harder to find. Reflect again on the act of sitting an exam. On the surface, it promotes equality. Every student responds to the same questions under controlled conditions. However, please take a look at what is left out. The exam presumes that knowledge can be reduced to what is measurable in that context. Creativity, humor, or thinking beyond the confines of a question are not recognized. In this way, rationalization favors what can be calculated and controlled, even if that involves excluding what cannot be quantified. A human being becomes a score on a page, ranked against others. Efficiency is enhanced, but richness of thought is lost. Rationalization constantly extends these habits into unexpected areas. Even leisure activities are affected. Sports enforce strict rules and depend on timers and statistics. Travel relies on schedules, tickets, and checkpoints. Yield, safety checks, and packaging figures track food production. You can depend on predictable results when booking a trip or buying groceries. However, much of the spontaneity that once defined these activities has been removed by procedures. It is tempting to view this as straightforward progress. Indeed, eliminating superstition, arbitrary judgment, or inefficiency seems wholly positive. Weber warned, however, that this is not the case. Rationalization fosters both liberation and discipline. It removes oppressive uncertainty while also imposing the constraints of impersonal systems. A gain in safety or fairness is paired with a reduction in how freely or meaningfully one can envision freedom. That tension clarifies why Weber argued that rationalization must be seen as both a progress and a burden. People acquire new skills to control their environment, yet they often find themselves operating within increasingly restrictive frameworks. To be liberated from myth can also mean inhabiting structures that feel mechanical. Life becomes organized by processes you did not choose, and once personal activities become formalized beyond recognition. Rationalization, which promised to free you from arbitrariness, risks trapping you instead. When rules, paperwork, and procedures control every step, society becomes efficient, but at the expense of warmth and spontaneity. That is why Weber warned about its darker side. Every success was bought at the cost of a shrinking horizon of meaning. His description of this progression culminated in one of his most haunting images, the Iron Cage. Modern life, under relentless pressure to work, calculate, and conform to impersonal systems, ceases to feel free. Rationalization constructs walls of procedure that people must navigate, and eventually, it can resemble imprisonment within efficiency itself. Rules, intended to liberate, harden into bars that restrict choice. Yet Weber also understood that societies do not accept discipline solely because of these systems. For rationalization to persist, it needs authority that people see as legitimate. Systems only become firm when they are backed by the forms of rule that make obedience possible. And it is to those forms, the very foundations of how order is maintained, that we now turn. Authority exists in various forms, and Weber identified three main types that ensure the stability of authority: traditional, charismatic, and legal rational. Each relies on a different basis of legitimacy, explains why people agree to be governed, and together they demonstrate that societies do not comply solely through force. Traditional authority is based on the sanctity of custom. Its power derives from the belief that this is how it has always been. Commands are accepted not because of efficiency or inspiration, but because they reflect practices passed down through generations. The ruler in this context is not merely an individual issuing orders, but a symbolic guardian of continuity. For example, a medieval king drew legitimacy from lineage, coronation rituals, and the doctrine of divine right. Resisting him was to oppose the weight of inherited order. This pattern also appears in smaller settings. Within families, parents uphold authority through tradition. Children obey not just out of fear, but also because they expect to, as respect for parental roles has become an integral part of the family framework. The exact process is evident, whether in the household, among the village elders, or among the monarch. Obedience is based on honoring established customs. Weber also distinguished between two types within this form of rule. Patriarchalism describes situations where power is exercised directly, such as in kinship groups, without the intervention of an official staff. In contrast, patrimonial domination arises in larger societies, where rulers command a body of officials or vassals who enforce their will, as in feudal estates. This extension enables traditional authority to operate on a larger scale while still relying on inherited norms. Despite the difference in size, the core logic remains. The rule is justified because of an appeal to the past rather than innovation or personal brilliance. Charismatic authority originates from a very different source of legitimacy. Here, obedience stems from the leader's extraordinary presence. Charisma is not rooted in tradition or law, but in the belief that a person has qualities beyond the ordinary: vision, courage, or what followers might perceive as divine signs. Notably, Weber emphasized that these qualities are not inherent traits of the leader. Instead, they are attributed by followers. In other words, charisma exists in the eye of the beholder. What matters are the perceptions and the faith among people that this individual possesses exceptional gifts, warranting absolute loyalty. You can feel the power of such authority. Imagine the prophet during a crisis, the reformer who opposes the establishment, or the revolutionary who rallies crowds with just their speech. The devotion here isn't ordinary. It comes from recognizing that someone stands apart. Charisma depends on energy, movement, and a sense of change. It can break down old systems and reshape collective values, primarily because it doesn't require obedience to laws or respect for traditions. Instead, it demands surrender to the vision of a person regarded as extraordinary. Yet, this very power renders charisma unstable. The structure relies on belief, which can fade over time. When followers no longer witness the promised results, or when circumstances change, charisma tends to weaken. For legitimacy to last, charisma often needs to be routinized, transformed into offices, doctrines, or organizations that can sustain authority beyond the lifetime or presence of the original leader. Without this, charismatic movements risk collapsing as suddenly as they rose. It is a force of disruption and change, not a stable framework of governance. Legal rational authority, by contrast, is the form most familiar in modern societies. Here, Obedience does not depend on tradition or extraordinary individuals. Instead, it relies on impersonal rules. Legitimacy stems from the legality of enacted norms and the procedures used to implement them. Everyone, including those in authority, is subject to the same system. The judge or officer does not command based on family status or personal charisma, but because they hold an office whose decisions are defined and limited by law. This point is crucial. In legal rational authority, the office holder is himself subject to the impersonal order. Authority exists within a framework of norms, not in the individual. That is why this form upholds fairness. Commands are justified by procedure, not by the authority issuing them. It depends on regular conduct, clearly defined competences, rights of appeal, and specialized training. It is predictable, reproducible, and theoretically universal. A bureaucratic civil service exemplifies this clearly. Officials are legally independent individuals, personally autonomous, who assume their roles through formal appointment rather than kinship or tradition. They operate within a hierarchy, receive fixed salaries, and are bound by rules known beforehand. Because they are personally free, their authority is entirely linked to their office. This characteristic distinguishes bureaucracy from traditional authority structures, such as families, where membership is not voluntary and roles are typically inherited rather than chosen. In Weber's assessment, bureaucracy is the purest form of legal rational authority, valued for its technical superiority. Each form reveals a different aspect of legitimacy. A monarchy shows how tradition maintains continuity. A revolutionary prophet illustrates how charisma can drive sudden change. A modern court or government bureau exemplifies legal rational routine. None of these can simply replace the others. A bureaucracy may provide efficiency, but it cannot inspire devotion. A prophet can initiate change, but cannot manage taxation for centuries. A king can represent tradition, but may struggle to adapt when circumstances call for innovation. Weber's typology is crucial because it shows how societies embed authority in different ways. Each form reflects not only power structures, but also mentalities of obedience. Traditional authority demands loyalty to customs. Charismatic authority demands loyalty to a vision, and legal rational authority demands loyalty to laws. By recognizing these, you see how the same act of obedience can arise from respect for heritage, belief in an individual, or trust in procedures. It is also essential to notice that these forms rarely exist in isolation. They tend to interweave. Tradition provides stability, but can become rigid, leading to disaffection. At such points, charisma can emerge, drawing people towards new visions. Once enthusiasm spreads, some form of legal rational order may be needed to routinize and sustain what charisma has achieved. Similarly, bureaucracies often adorn their procedures with ceremonial rituals that evoke tradition, or leaders use charisma to rally support for institutional frameworks. Authority is rarely pure. It usually results from a shifting balance among these types. Modern states rely heavily on legal rational authority, but traces of other types of authority remain visible. Political leaders build charisma during elections, while state institutions derive legitimacy from long-standing traditions, such as ceremonies or symbolic offices. The complexity of authority resides in its mixtures, and how societies stabilize and revitalize themselves by shifting along this spectrum. Yet within this spectrum lies tension. Tradition binds but can stagnate. Rules stabilize but can harden into rigid cages. Charisma inspires but struggles to endure. The dynamic interplay of these three facets of authority shapes not only the endurance of regimes, but also the bursts of change that punctuate history. And it is here, at the edge where routine falters, that Weber recognized another crucial possibility. Sometimes obedience does not stem from sacred custom or impersonal rules at all. It emerges in moments when followers perceive a figure as extraordinary, when energy suddenly concentrates around a leader who appears different from others. That kind of authority breaks through existing order like a spark igniting dry grass. And it is to that spark we now turn. Charisma and the spark of change signify a significant departure from traditional authority. Weber argued that there are times when legitimacy no longer relies on tradition or written law, but instead emanates from the magnetism of a leader recognized as extraordinary. This form of authority, charismatic authority, depends not on inherited office or formal procedure, but on followers' belief that they are in the presence of someone who embodies a power beyond the ordinary. Charisma often emerges during times of deep need or crisis, when traditions break down or laws seem unable to meet the urgency of a moment. People seek something else, something immediate and inspiring. It erupts like wildfire in a dry forest, spreading rapidly and intensely. Where society appears stagnant, charisma sparks energy and passion, filling lives with purpose almost overnight. Its power is immense, but because it is so closely connected to the immediacy of devotion, it is also fragile. One of Weber's most notable assertions is that charisma does not reside within a person as an innate quality. It only exists when people choose to perceive it and respond accordingly. Charisma depends on recognition. For a leader to be charismatic, followers must identify qualities they consider extraordinary, and in doing so, they create the connection themselves. This is why Weber could say that leaders are made by their followers. Charisma is built in the interaction between a figure and the people who respond, and it relies on their willingness to accept the leader as exceptional. That act of recognition fosters what Weber described as Vergemeinschaftung, the formation of an emotional community. Unlike the cold, impersonal nature of bureaucratic society, charisma draws strangers into a group that feels warm and alive. People who might otherwise stay distant come to see themselves as united by faith in a common cause. It becomes more than mere obedience. It feels like belonging to a vibrant fellowship, an emotional circle with the leader at its center. History is filled with instances where these movements go beyond the ordinary. A prophet in an era of doubt, a revolutionary amidst oppression, or a reformer challenging injustice. None of these derive their authority from tradition or official positions, but from the passionate endorsement of their followers. Change occurs because people believe, and through their belief, they overturn norms that once seemed unassailable. Charisma functions precisely because it sidesteps usual rules and checks. What makes charisma truly revolutionary is its ability to change values. Weber emphasized that it acts as a revolution from within. Instead of gradually transforming systems through procedures, a charismatic leader convinces followers that they must live by an entirely different set of values. Traditions once regarded as sacred can collapse in a sudden moment of collective awakening. A legal code once considered permanent may lose its authority when large numbers of people suddenly withdraw their moral support. Charisma overturns the moral framework itself, rewriting what is regarded as correct, accurate, or valuable in the eyes of its community. You can observe this power in significant social movements that transformed entire societies within just a decade. The civil rights movement in the United States serves as an example. Charismatic leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. inspired countless people not through legislation or inherited positions, but through the force of recognition, and shared conviction. In less than 10 years, attitudes towards race and even gender shifted in ways that would have otherwise taken a century of slow, incremental reform. This kind of leap, Weber argued, showcases charisma's unique energy. Where legal rational authority advances gradually, charisma accelerates change through passion and recognition. Of course, because charisma burns so brightly, it also risks burning out. Unlike tradition, it lacks continuity, and unlike law, it has no codified procedures. Everything depends on the immediate presence of the leader and the devotion of their followers. If the leader falters, dies, or loses recognition, the movement can quickly collapse. The wild energy that drives it forward has little to anchor it when storms of doubt arise. Weber called this issue the routinization of charisma. To endure, charisma must be captured and directed into something more structured. Different solutions emerge. Some leaders appoint a successor, hoping that the mantle of recognition will pass to their chosen heir. Others rely on hereditary succession, as if the extraordinary quality of charisma could be inherited. North Korea provides an extreme example. In some cases, charisma is transferred into offices, where the title itself begins to carry the aura of authority even after the individual founder has departed. Each attempt reflects the same challenge: how to turn a fleeting burst of recognition into lasting order. This struggle creates a paradox. Charisma flourishes by disrupting dull structures and bypassing formal paths. Yet, to survive, it must eventually be absorbed into those very structures. If it fails, the energy dissipates and the followers scatter. If it endures, it often does so by being transformed into traditions, doctrines, or institutions that tame the original spark. The wild vision that inspired new values slowly solidifies into predictable patterns. Charisma, then, tends to emerge at inflection points, moments of disruption when tradition and law seem insufficient. In those moments, recognition and emotional community generate extraordinary motivation for change. However, maintaining that motivation always involves compromise. Either the movement disappears with the leader's departure, or it institutionalizes its energy into systems that replace recognition with officialdom. What started as a living devotion becomes a routine of authority. Weber's insight into charisma highlights the fragility at the core of change. The ability to radically shift values and inspire solidarity comes with a cost: the inability to achieve permanence without institutionalization. Flashes of charismatic breakthroughs mark human history, but almost always those breakthroughs either fade or are transformed into more lasting forms. The emotional fervor endures only when it is regularized into structure. And in modern societies, it is most often bureaucracy that carries out this process of taming. It is bureaucracy that transforms charisma's spark into procedures, offices, and hierarchies, enabling movements to persist. What once depended on recognition by a community is reformed into a machine of efficiency. Charisma can thus be the seed, but bureaucracy becomes the framework. This passage, which transitions from personal devotion to structured offices, sets the stage for the next part of Weber's argument. If charisma is the most volatile source of authority, bureaucracy is its most stable. However, stability comes with its own costs. To understand how order consolidates into such a lasting form, you need to examine bureaucracy itself more closely, the organized, rule-bound engine of modern efficiency. Bureaucracy often has an unflattering reputation. The word evokes images of long queues, endless forms, and stamped documents. Yet Weber understood it differently. In his analysis, bureaucracy was not a hindrance to order, but its most effective engine. While tradition and charisma could inspire loyalty or change, he viewed bureaucracy as the structure that maintained stability and ensured the functioning of modern life. It may seem dull and gray, but without it, complex societies would fall into chaos. That raises an important question. How did rule-bound offices, often mocked for their rigidity, become the dominant model across states, businesses, and universities? Weber's insight was that bureaucracy, considered as an ideal type, is the most efficient way to organize activity once societies reach a certain level of complexity. This ideal type is not a perfect real-world specimen, but rather a conceptual model that shows how bureaucracies operate at their purest. Key features that enable this include offices filled by merit, a strict hierarchy of authority, and decisions based on impersonal rules rather than personal favor. In practical terms, positions are not inherited or gained through patronage. They are obtained via contracts, with entry based on competence and training. Officials are expected to perform their duties not as personal favors, but within a larger organizational structure. Their salaries are fixed, and their careers follow standard paths of promotion. The result is a system where outcomes can be planned and forecasted. When engaging with an office holder, you are not dealing with an individual's whim, but with an impersonal system of rules. Weber referred to this as domination through knowledge, where authority arises from the organized expertise that supports the organization. Hierarchy is fundamental. Bureaucracies are organized like staircases. Each office has a transparent sphere of competence, is directly accountable to a higher office, and is supported by subordinate offices below. Every decision can be traced upwards for supervision, and if someone considers it arbitrary, they have the right to appeal to a superior. This significantly reduces the random judgments seen in traditional systems, where outcomes often depended on personal biases or custom. In bureaucracies, clarity comes from the chain of command. To illustrate this, Weber proposed imagining a machine. Each cog has a specific function, whether large or small, and is connected to the others. A cog is replaceable. It's less important who it is than what task it performs. Remove too many, and the machine stalls, but no single cog defines the entire system. This exemplifies bureaucracy in its ideal type. The power resides not in any individual's brilliance, but in coordination. Legality, training, and impersonality underpin its strength, and the system's predictability replaces the uncertainty of personal command. Examples clarify this concept. Consider a postal service. Letters travel across a country because procedures dictate each step of sorting, dispatch, and delivery. A staff member cannot casually choose to deliver one letter faster than another. The rulebook ensures predictability. Or take a university, perhaps closer to your own experience. Admissions offices follow fixed criteria. Degree requirements depend on specified credits, and final results are reported on systematic scales. You may not always agree with the grade, but you can be assured that the same standards are used to evaluate students. This can feel impersonal, but it allows thousands to navigate the system with confidence. Another key feature is that bureaucracies rely on technical expertise. Their strength lies in appointing professionals with specialized training, legal experts, engineers, economists, doctors, into positions. Unlike heredity or patronage, this guarantees tasks are performed competently. Once again, Weber used the phrase, "Bureaucracy is domination through knowledge." If one official leaves, another trained specialist can replace them, without disrupting the entire system. This makes bureaucratic systems resilient, ensuring continuity over years and even centuries. Weber also emphasized that bureaucracy is not exclusive to capitalism. In fact, he argued that socialism would necessitate a greater level of bureaucratization because market mechanisms would no longer handle allocation. Socialism would require a still higher degree of formal bureaucratization than capitalism, he wrote. Planning production and distributing resources without markets would demand a vast administrative apparatus. The implication was striking. Bureaucracy is not the product of capitalism, but of the scale and complexity of modern social life. Yet bureaucracy is never unlimited. Weber observed counterbalances that constrain its growth. One was collegiality, especially strong in professions like medicine. If you consult one doctor for a second opinion, they are not expected to declare that their colleague got it wrong openly. Professional solidarity moderates pure bureaucratic procedure, maintaining respect among peers. Another check comes from the separation of powers in political life. Following Montesquieu's insight, the division between executive, legislative, and judicial branches prevents absolute bureaucratic dominance. Representative mechanisms also play a role, with elected bodies overseeing bureaucracies. These restraints inject pluralism and prevent machinery from becoming unchecked. Despite these limitations, bureaucracy still offers significant advantages in terms of efficiency and predictability. Applying for a license involves steps that are clearly outlined in a procedure. Want to know how your taxes are calculated? Tables and rules present the process in advance. Competing for civil service positions? Entry relies on exams and merit, not family connections. The contrast with traditional authority is pronounced. Outcomes depend on impersonal processes rather than personal favor or arbitrary judgment. But there is also a cost. Bureaucracy prioritizes what Weber called formal rationality. That means procedures carry authority even when content feels secondary. A decision becomes legitimate because it was reached correctly, not necessarily because it is wise or humane. This ensures fairness by preventing personal bias, but it also creates rigidity. An application can be rejected for leaving one line empty, even if the person qualifies in every respect. Sometimes, fairness by procedure overlooks the situation itself. Weber warned of this tension. Bureaucracy's strength lies in establishing reliable systems that people can trust. However, the same rules that create clarity also limit freedom. Officials are unable to act out of compassion if it conflicts with regulations. Clients cannot appeal to friendship, as friendship holds no official weight. When dealing with bureaucracy, you do not interact directly with individuals. You engage with offices. This depersonalization is precisely what makes it efficient, but it also signals the start of its potential danger. Public ridicule of bureaucracy often centers on frustration, the long waits, the stamps, the redundant forms. However, Weber urged us to look beneath the surface. Bureaucracy may cause frustration, but it also enables modern life. Without it, millions of daily transactions could not be coordinated predictably. Mail would not arrive, public services would falter, universities would struggle to treat thousands of students consistently, and hospitals would fail to provide systematic care. The efficiency that makes all this possible is linked to procedures we sometimes resent. Seen in this light, bureaucracy becomes less comical and more extraordinary. In its ideal type, it is the most technically efficient form of organization. It operates through knowledge, hierarchy, and impersonality, enabling modern societies to function on a scale and scope unknown to earlier eras. However, the order and predictability it provides have a double effect. Efficiency can easily turn into rigidity, and impersonality into indifference. For Weber, the very system that facilitates mass society can also entrap those who live within it. And this is the warning that shadows all of bureaucracy's achievements. Orders created by offices can operate so efficiently that individuals forget their place within it. What appears to be a rational framework promising fairness may, in practice, tighten into rules that leave little scope for human need. The same machine that sustains society can also confine it. And it is here that Weber introduced his most famous metaphor, the Iron Cage. Life within this system offers fairness, predictability, and consistency. On the surface, these qualities appear to be progress. Instead of depending on the moods of rulers or the privileges of tradition, you see outcomes guided by rules intended to treat everyone equally. However, the very principle that supports equality can also require rigidity. As regulations increase, the system starts to feel less like a shield and more like a structure pressing down on those inside it. The confinement Weber described is not made of metal, but of procedures, schedules, and obligations. Its heaviness is not physical, but internal. You find yourself compelled to act in ways that satisfy processes rather than desire. In many situations, you work or comply not because you freely choose to, but because the framework of requirements leaves little room for alternative actions. The restriction feels invisible until you notice that your options have diminished and that your efforts serve the system rather than your own intentions. This is most evident in everyday frustrations. Imagine filling out the same form repeatedly, each version slightly changed. You provide your basic information repeatedly until the process itself feels detached from your genuine intent. If one detail is missing, a box left unticked, a date entered wrongly, the whole step collapses. It does not matter that your case is urgent or that you are clearly qualified. What matters is compliance with the form. The impersonal system enforces control not through violence, but through insistence on the correct entry of details. The same frustration arises when you visit an office for an urgent matter, only to find it closed due to business hours. The staff inside stick to their schedule, even if your issue demands immediate attention. The timetable overrides the situation. Everyone perceives fairness in the rule, but the outcome sacrifices flexibility and personal responsiveness. Predictability wins, but humanity disappears. At other times, the gap is even greater. A decision that impacts your life can be made by officials you never meet, in places you never see. The answer arrives as a printed notice, citing regulations you cannot challenge. No one considers the story behind your situation. Procedure determines the outcome. Such distance embodies the paradox Weber warned about. Legitimacy comes from rules applied universally, yet the result often feels detached or even arbitrary when you are on the receiving end of impersonal consistency. Weber described the core of this system as formalistic impersonality. In his words, bureaucracy operates sine ira et studio, without hatred and without passion. Officials are expected to avoid personal sympathy as much as they avoid personal bias. They must act not out of compassion or frustration, but solely according to the rules. This impersonal approach is what ensures equal treatment. However, the very feature that promises fairness can also create alienation. When your identity is reduced to a case number or file, it can feel as though the cost of objectivity is the loss of individuality. What makes this form of control striking is that it is not imposed by conspiracy. It is the natural consequence of rationalization itself. The same force that brought about efficiency and fairness also caused depersonalization. Bureaucracy was never meant to dehumanize, yet its impersonality is an inherent part of its success. Repeated attempts to eliminate prejudice or whim led to the creation of systematic rules, which gradually became central to the organization. The result is a framework that governs life with extraordinary reach, regardless of whether it notices the people moving within it. This reality often becomes the subject of satire. Many works of literature and film depict ordinary characters lost in a maze of procedures. Franz Kafka portrayed clerks wandering through endless corridors of offices, desperately seeking recognition from faceless authorities. More modern stories exaggerate forms, permits, and signatures to absurd proportions, exposing how systems appear detached from the needs they claim to serve. These depictions resonate because they reflect an experience you already know: the feeling of standing before a structure that listens only to its own rules. The real power of the cage lies in how easily you accept its framework. You follow procedures every time you apply for identification, register for education, prove ownership, or pay taxes. Each step is justified, each rule seems fair, yet together they create an environment you cannot ignore. You adjust your behavior to forms, waiting rooms, deadlines, and signatures. Over time, the rhythm of the system begins to determine when you work, how you behave, and what options you see as possible. However, Weber emphasized that we must also recognize what would be lost without these procedures. Without rules, judgment would revert to personal whim and corruption. Prejudice, privilege, or favoritism could replace fair treatment. Bureaucracy liberates while also constraining. You avoid the burden of arbitrary authority while submitting to the impersonal force of procedure. Viewed from this perspective, life inside the cage signifies a more profound shift, akin to freedom. Rationalization enhances your ability to control the external world, providing dependable laws, medical treatments based on science, and rights that can be upheld across society. However, these gains also limit the potential for meaning. Tasks are reduced to numbers to be measured. Lives are reduced to files to be processed. Individuals become trapped within systems that claim to manage fairness, but seldom capture its proper depth. It is this narrowing that begins to create alienation, a feeling that life is ordered yet lacking immediacy. The effects become clear in work. Your performance is measured through targets, contracts, and tangible outputs. This ensures fairness and opportunity, but limits creativity. Promotions and rewards are more based on meeting system criteria than on inspiration. Your contribution begins to take shape as a quantifiable output, evaluated impartially, regardless of how creatively you executed it. The nature of work shifts from self-expression to following procedures. The same applies to personal life. Whether getting married, traveling, or seeking help, you demonstrate your existence through documents and codes. A system cannot sense your warmth or kindness. It only registers the proper stamp, signature, and date. What seems dependable to one person may seem distant to another. Life is only visible in formats that the structure recognizes, which hides the qualities that make experiences personal or intimate. Weber did not describe this as accidental. Rationalization was the source of extraordinary achievements. It was not guided by malice, but by the effort to eliminate bias and inconsistency. Yet those very qualities produced detachment from the values that once felt intrinsic to human life. The more complete the order, the narrower the space for subjective meaning. This is not a conspiracy, but a consequence, progress that carries its own shadow. Seeing this clearly involves understanding the double nature of modern life. The frameworks that uphold equality can also stifle individuality. The processes that safeguard you can also cause alienation. You depend on these structures every day, yet they silently influence how you think, act, and even envision your future. This paradox characterizes life inside the cage, safe, efficient, and impersonal. Recognizing this condition prompts the next, more urgent question. If progress itself shapes these boundaries, what becomes of your sense of freedom? What happens to meaning when life is influenced less by enchantment or personal worth, and more by rules, categories, and procedures? These are the questions Weber believed modern individuals must confront, and they lead us straight to the dilemma of freedom, meaning, and contemporary life. Freedom, meaning, and modern life lie at the heart of Weber's warning. The progress that once promised liberation can just as easily constrict the space where freedom is experienced. Rationalization and bureaucracy, initially celebrated as means to create fairness and remove arbitrariness, impose structures that regulate life so tightly that freedom becomes activity within rules rather than independence beyond them. The cage offers predictability, but at the expense of spontaneity. The core of this issue lies in disenchantment. Traditional societies cloaked daily acts in layers of symbolic meaning. A harvest linked to divine cycles, healing carried echoes of ritual, and ceremonies united communities through shared myths. As rationalization progressed, those symbolic layers were stripped away. Explanations became based on data, probabilities, and calculations. What once was filled with mystery was diluted into processes that could be measured. This is what Weber meant by disenchantment: the transformation of life's mysteries into problems solvable by calculation, leaving much of its symbolic depth behind. Such losses are not always immediately visible. Weather forecasts mitigate the devastation from storms. Codified law ensures consistency. Exams provide transparency in education. Rational measures make each example an improvement. However, with that gain comes a narrowing of meaning. Procedures replace rituals that once united communities. Acts that once inspired wonder are now standardized tasks. While the world is safer, it is also plainer, its color faded into algorithms and checklists. You notice this every day, especially at work. Performance reviews, productivity metrics, and targets achieved all become measures of your worth. What makes you unique, your generosity, imagination, or resilience, shrinks behind statistics. Rationalization does not capture the rich complexity of human life. It only records inputs and outputs. Historically, under the spirit of capitalism, accumulation itself was seen as ethical, a way of demonstrating discipline and benefiting the larger system. Today, those same calculations often feel detached, reducing individual differences to data points and stripping purpose from what was once experienced as a calling. This tension becomes clearer when contrasted with the importance of personal choices. If you assist a neighbor out of compassion, the connection created has a resonance that no rule can capture. The act is not just transactional, but fundamentally human. However, to rational systems, hours worked can be quantified and wages documented. Acts of care or loyalty disappear because they are beyond what bureaucracy can recognize. Emotional bonds and lived values constantly clash with the detached calculations of rational order. Education provides a clear example. A student succeeds because of a teacher's encouragement and belief in them. But at the end of the year, it was only the test score is recorded. Similarly, in medicine, a patient might seek reassurance or warmth, yet their visits, numerical readings, and coded diagnoses are often the focus. Both cases demonstrate how institutions aim to ensure fairness while neglecting individual significance. Rationalization ensures equality, but it struggles to understand the personal. For Weber, this was why the Iron Cage mattered. It was not just about the bureaucracy's inconvenience, but about how systems designed to protect end up stifling individuality. Freedom becomes like traveling on rails, efficient, smooth, but limited to predetermined directions. You can move quickly, but never off the track. On a large scale, this turns freedom into formality. Choices are constrained, and independence is reduced to what fits the procedure. Still, humans seek meaning even in confined spaces. People turn to projects, family, art, faith, or informal communities to restore values that rationalization cannot offer. Workplaces often cultivate cultures beyond job descriptions, layering camaraderie over routine. Or grassroots movements challenge official rules by forming alternative bonds of solidarity. Resistance here shows that individuals are not passive captives within the cage. They reinterpret, reshape, push back, and create spaces of meaning outside bureaucratic recognition. Yet here arises a more profound paradox. Resistance usually demands organization, and organization inevitably reintroduces bureaucracy. A protest becomes a committee, petitions require forms, and activism needs schedules. What begins as spontaneous passion must adopt a structured approach to survive. The pursuit of meaning often reproduces the very rationalization it opposes. The cage is rebuilt even as it is resisted. This cycle exemplifies Weber's view. Rationalization is not easily escaped, even when rejected by those who oppose it. So what is freedom in this context? For Weber, it was not the absence of rules. Rules are unavoidable in any society. The question is whether those rules still allow space for individuals to create and pursue meaning. If every action becomes defined by rational procedure, life reduces to mere function. But where systems create room for personal choice, dignity, or value, authenticity endures. Freedom emerges less from eradicating order than from ensuring that order does not swallow all meaning. That is why Weber's analysis was never simply anti-technology. Machines and inventions were not the problem. The issue lay in the values embedded in their use. Bureaucracy can be designed to maximize consistency at any cost, or it can be balanced with practices that protect human connection and culture. Rationalization may be unavoidable, but its form is not. The impact or significance of its presence depends on collective decisions about what to preserve alongside efficiency. This becomes even clearer when you consider how alienation develops. It is not gears and trains that create emptiness. It is when every sphere, even outside work, is shaped by the logic of calculation. A timetable can help travel smoothly, but life feels imprisoned when every hour is reduced to productivity alone. The divide between freedom and confinement does not run through machines, but through the dominance of rule-bound procedures over meaning. From this perspective, freedom is not about escaping bureaucracy, but recognizing its limits. It emerges when individuals refuse to have their worth solely measured by metrics. It is expressed in acts of creativity, in care that resists commodification, and in values that do not reduce to numbers. Freedom is experienced when life is not entirely confined within rational frameworks. Still, Weber warned that sustaining such awareness is difficult. Bureaucratic power is strong because it seems natural. When forms and schedules set every rhythm, they appear to be the only possible reality. Filling out paperwork or queuing feels unavoidable. Soon, the procedure becomes not just a structure, but a belief. The iron cage affects people less through chains than through the quiet acceptance that no alternative exists. Your challenge in modern life, then, is to notice how systems shape meaning, to question whether obedience safeguards fairness or merely sustains habit. Seeing clearly creates space for freedom and for values that resist being reduced to calculation. Without such reflection, enchantment is not just lost, it is forgotten. With it, however, freedom can still hold depth, and this perspective consistently brings us back to Weber's central puzzle. If people operate within these systems, often limited and depersonalized, then why do they continue to obey them? The next step is to investigate that question and understand how the grant's rules and authority have had their enduring influence. Why do people obey in the first place? For Weber, the answer required a crucial distinction. He separated Macht, power, the ability to impose your will despite resistance, from Herrschaft, which is best translated as domination or authority. Domination goes beyond the raw capacity to coerce. It creates an asymmetrical relationship in which commands are obeyed because they are perceived as legitimate. What appears to stabilize societies is not power alone, but the transformation of power into domination through legitimacy. It is simple to explain compliance through fear. Disobey a state, and punishment might follow. However, if fear were the only basis, order would break down the moment the threat disappeared. You stop at a red traffic light, even when no officer is in sight. You file your taxes, even when the chances of an audit are slim. The constant presence of force does not drive these actions. They instead arise from something quieter, a sense that the command is based on legitimate grounds. This is legitimacy, the belief that authority has the right to issue commands and that you have reason to follow. Think of legitimacy as the difference between brute force and lasting order. Raw power can enforce compliance temporarily, but once it turns away, resistance reappears. Domination depends on deeper acceptance, the belief that rules are valid. When obedience feels justified, it endures even beyond monitoring. That internal acceptance makes domination less fragile than power alone. You carry the obligation inside yourself and obey willingly, even while coercion remains in the background. For Weber, this was central to his analysis of modern rule. Domination was not merely enforcement, it was the merging of power with belief. Leaders and institutions do not rely solely on threats. They sustain stability by producing beliefs, or what Weber referred to as mythologies, that justify their authority. These mythologies do not have to be factual, they can be interpreted as such. Their power lies in their acceptance. They convince people that obeying commands is not just about survival, but about finding purpose. Such myths take many forms. A monarch may claim divine blessing, grounding obedience in faith. A revolutionary may invoke destiny or historic necessity, making opposition unthinkable. A modern bureaucracy may present itself as impartial and fair, claiming legitimacy through consistency and rules. In each case, narratives turn power into domination because individuals internalize them as justifications. Force remains available, but most obedience comes from belief. That acceptance explains why bureaucratic rule functions so effectively. Bureaucracy is convincing not because punishment is always used, but because it appears lawful and consistent. Its core promise is that commands come from procedures, not personal desire. You obey because the order is justified by a framework you also believe applies to everyone. Importantly, this perception also applies to officials themselves. In legal rational authority, no one is above the rules. Officials are bound by the same system they enforce. Legitimacy comes not from their personal will, but from the system that demands recognition. Consider once more the passport office. The process can be tedious, filled with forms, queues, and identification documents. You might complain about the wait, but you still comply. Why? Not because the officer behind the desk forces you through personal power. You obey because you recognize the necessity of identification and accept that the state has the authority to require it. The legitimacy lies not in the clerk, but in the legal order the office represents. Their jurisdiction is office-bound and systemic. You respond to it because the structure itself is recognized as valid. Here, Weber's three forms of authority shed light. Traditional authority is compelling due to sacred custom. Charismatic authority commands through devotion to extraordinary figures. Legal rational authority persuades through the legitimacy of law and procedure. In modern societies, it is this last form that dominates. Its strength relies on stability. Trained specialists fill offices, rules apply universally, and orders are justified by reference to enacted norms rather than favoritism. Obedience flows from the belief that the system itself is rightful, not that any one individual deserves personal loyalty. Yet, within this very strength lies a paradox. Bureaucracy depends on your belief that its commands are valid. However, the very impersonality that maintains fairness also creates a sense of distance. When you are denied a service because of an unchecked box, you still comply, but you feel disconnected from the process. The legitimacy remains, but meaning becomes strained. You accept the structure even as you feel alienated from it. The cage stays solid, not through force, but because you still trust the rules that define it. It is remarkable how deeply this belief permeates everyday life. You accept an officer's signal to stop your car, not just to avoid punishment, but because the uniform and gesture invoke a lawful system perceived as legitimate. Without that shared belief, the officer is just another person in the street. The authority stems from your recognition, supported by the society-wide understanding that the order carries legitimate force. This also explains why societies withstand disagreements without collapsing. You might dislike a policy, yet still follow it because you respect the broader framework as fair. Dissent does not topple the regime because legitimacy channels conflict into procedural means through courts, petitions, or elections. Stability comes not from eliminating disputes, but from transforming them into recognized forms. This creates resilience far greater than the fragile rule of mere terror could offer. Of course, legitimacy is not eternal. When mythologies lose credibility, or when procedures seem corrupt or unjust, the willingness to obey can diminish rapidly. A state that once commanded routine obedience may suddenly face widespread disobedience. This fragility, in Weber's view, compelled rulers to uphold rituals and symbols that affirm justice. Whether through tradition, charisma, or legality, sustained dominance depends on ongoing reinforcement of belief. So, to answer the question once more, why do you follow? Not only because fear of punishment influences you, not only because habit drains resistance. You obey the rules and institutions because they seem valid, and you accept their claim to authority. Obedience becomes stable when domination combines force with internal belief. For Weber, this was the enduring lesson. Bureaucracy persists not just through threats of sanctions, but because it persuades you that procedure itself is justifiable. Its commands seem meaningful, even when they are issued impersonally. But the final turn in Weber's argument is sobering. If the iron cage of rationalization and bureaucracy maintains its strength through legitimacy, then its endurance depends not on chains, but on acceptance. Its bars are supported by collective belief in myths and procedures. This raises the most troubling question of all. What you see as freedom may actually be obedience, quietly lived within a framework that seems natural. This recognition places us at a crossroads. The world of rules offers equality, but it also risks limiting the depth of meaning. How you respond, whether by questioning traditional structures or by reshaping them with new values, determines the future of modern life. Modern freedom often appears as progress, but Weber warned it can also resemble an iron cage. Bureaucracy and rational rules create order, yet they limit choice by guiding life along fixed and predictable paths. What seems just can subtly become restrictive when meaning is lost and only procedure remains. Efficiency, in this sense, forms the framework of society, but its spirit cannot stem from paperwork or offices. It must come from you. Meaning arises through the values you choose to uphold. So ask yourself, how much of your obedience is voluntary, and how much is inherited from the cage?